talking about extreme wealth, that it's an issue of envy, or it's an issue of just plain lifestyles of the rich and famous, or something like that, and also a broad failure on the part, I believe, of many people to understand just how much money we are talking about. Why do we care? So there are multiple issues. If we're talking about who might be asked to pay somewhat higher taxes, to pay for expanded social safety net programs of various kinds, investments in children and so on, you probably are going to be talking about taxes that are a little bit beyond the 1%. If you're talking about people who are in one way or another insulated from many of the concerns that face the typical American family, you're already in that range at the 1%. But there are some really important issues where a much smaller group plays a critical role, and as I think every speaker is probably going to argue, a distorting role in our society. Some of those are more diffuse. I would argue, though without being able to quantify it, that there are social costs, that there is damages to our sense of ourselves as a society from having people who are just completely in a different material universe from the rest of the population. But what I want to focus on for this morning's remarks are the political implications of having people with a very, very large amount of money and a very small group of people. There's a group, and we don't need to define it too exactly. Maybe it's the 0.01%, which is really what people have in mind. This is a group that is elusive. But what we've been learning recently is that there's tax avoidance and evasion. The difference is one of legality, but in terms of the implications, not that different. That tax avoidance is a really big deal at the top. That we really have only a very imperfect notion of how much money there is there. It's also an elusive group in terms of its role in the political system. I'm an avid consumer of quantitative political science, and there have been several recent studies, particularly there's a relatively new book by Paige Seawright called Billionaires and Stealth Politics, which talked about how, in fact, great wealth is deployed on behalf of political decisions. And groups like the billionaires who just said, please tax us, are what you hear about. And it's great that they do this. They're also extremely exceptional. And what you have, by and large, is billionaires spending large sums of money to promote their own self-interest in ways that are mostly below the radar, are really quite hard to track. This gives this very small group of people a lot of power. We have a formally democratic one-person, one-vote system. In practice, dollars talk quite loudly. The reasons they do are themselves a little bit elusive. I think if you'd asked even me 5 years ago how much raw corruption, just plain bribery, there is in this system, I would have said, well, that's probably not a big deal. And actually, I don't think that anymore. There's probably a whole lot more of that than we think there is. There's a lot of soft corruption. People may not even quite admit to themselves that it's corrupt. There's campaign contributions, which we talk about a lot, which are definitely a big deal, although I think maybe less of a big deal than we think, if only because at this point there's so much money floating around in politics that it probably runs into diminishing returns at some point. But the thing that really motivated me as I started to think about was the extent to which the very wealthy get to define the agenda, get to define the boundaries, to the Overton window, if you like, the notions of what is considered to be a responsible, sensible policy. What things do you need to worry about? How do we pay for, and which things do you not? Which things are considered to be sound, responsible policy, and which things are not? But that's been a really big deal on multiple fronts.